Okay. Right. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Okay, great. Can you hear me? Yeah? If I become inaudible, please wave your hands around. That's a very, very hard act to follow, isn't it? Thank you, Nazir. That was an extraordinary, powerful and important and moving speech, and how lucky we are to have people like him around. And this is going to be a bit less exciting, I'm afraid, but if we want to start to think about how do we even start to frame these, overwhelmingly difficult and distressing issues in a way that helps us to move forward, then I hope what I'm going to say has something to offer. So, and I don't know if you can see these slides very clearly given the sunshine, but you can have the slides afterwards. It's not necessary to read all the stuff on the slides. I will point out to you and read out the bits that are most relevant. So I'm going to do the world's very briefest and quickest overview of a ridiculously long and ambitious project, which is called the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which is an ambitious attempt to outline an alternative, a non-diagnostic approach to psychological and emotional distress to replace our current diagnostic model, which is based on people's attempts to survive and make meanings within their relational and social circumstances. And it's an optional set of ideas. It's not a manual. It doesn't say do this and this and this in these circumstances. It's a set of ideas because it seemed to us that we really need to fundamentally rethink the very core assumptions that are everywhere about how we understand distress. It's optional. It's not just about people who are said to have mental health problems. That's not a distinction we recognise in the framework. It's about all of us. And there are a great number of resources, podcasts, slides, other sources of information on the website link, which you have there. And these are the contributors to the project over a 5-year period. We're mostly psychologists. I and Mary Boyle are the lead authors. Jackie and Ellen are survivors of the system, so this is a co-produced document. We had a number of other people involved as the project continued. About a third of the roughly 40 people had personal experience of being on the receiving end of psychiatric interventions. And from our shared clinical research and lived experience perspective, we have all known each other for a very long time and felt very passionately that we need some fundamentally different ways of understanding distress. Here's a very short plug. I have a few of these books to sell. It's cheaper from me than on Amazon, and only 12 quid, and it's probably the easiest way into the framework if you're interested in thinking about how this might apply to you, someone you're working with or supporting. And it's attracted a lot of interest. We may have a bit of time to talk about that. It's actually been taken up far more widely than we ever thought it would, given it's, to be honest, a fairly dense, long document that's not very easy to get your head around at first reading. But nevertheless, I think the fact it's spread so widely, being translated into a number of different languages, does speak to the fact that people recognise there's something about the way we think about distress and trouble or troubling behaviour that is not helping, that is actually inappropriate and very often actually unhelpful and indeed re-traumatising. And there's been some backlash, as you might expect. I think that's kind of inevitable when you're challenging a number of, ways of thinking, but also institutions and professionals and systems. So in the simplest terms, the framework aims to replace our diagnostic understandings, all these words that are everywhere, our clinical depression, our bipolar disorder, our mental illness, our all sorts of other labels that are increasingly not only being applied, but people are queuing up to apply to themselves, which I have to say I think is quite a regrettable trend, to replace diagnostic understandings with narrative ones. And I very much agree with Nazir that narratives are powerful. They're powerful in helping us to actually listen to people and understand what's going on. They can also be very powerful in healing, a lot more powerful, I would suggest, than giving someone a diagnostic label. So the particular kind of narratives which the framework promotes are those which recognise that people's experiences, however apparently unusual or extreme or troubled or troubling, are understandable in context, a narrative that makes a link between those experiences and the context of the person's life, that increases someone's sense of ability and power to change things in their lives to the extent that that's possible, and that promotes social action. And we really must not miss the link between people's personal experience of distress and the roots of those those various forms of distress that people present with. Very much like what Nazir was saying, it's not just about prosecuting a number of different cases, it's about looking at the roots of the behaviour and that led up to those cases. So the framework draws quite extensively on trauma-informed approaches. A lot of the framework isn't new. We hope it's a slightly new way of putting it together that makes it accessible and powerful and applicable across a wide range of settings. The book that I mentioned is about one-to-one narratives, but in principle, a framework narrative could apply at any level. There could be narratives about families, about communities, about cultures and countries, and so on. So it's not about saying all the great work that we're going to hear about today needs to be replaced by this. It's about saying we need a much bigger, a meta framework, if you like, that supports and validates and provides extra evidence for all the excellent work that's already going on from non-diagnostic perspectives, and also suggests other ways forward. Okay, so these core PTMF questions are a suggested structure for a narrative, and the questions are an expansion of the slogan that you'll all be familiar with. Instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. And in PTMF framework terms, we've expanded that into what has happened to you, how is power operating in your life, how did it affect you, what kind of threats does this pose, what sense did you make of it, what is the meaning for these experiences to you, what did you have to do to survive, what kinds of threat response are you using. We're going to have a chance to look at this in a little bit more detail in the workshops. So, as I said, this is a bit of a whiz through. And you might want to add or start with what are your strengths and pull it together into what is your story. Now, this is really, really not intended to be some kind of new version of an assessment procedure. The questions don't have to be asked in those words, in that order. You frame them as you like. You start where it makes sense. They're overlapping questions. Each one implies the other, and each of them implies the rest, if you like, but they can nevertheless be a powerful way of framing a different, and in many cases, for some people for the first time, a non-medical narrative about their distress. And perhaps the most important thing we think we're adding to current ways of understanding distress is an emphasis on power. That's not completely absent, of course, from lots of people's work, but it's absent almost by definition from psychiatric understandings, which locate problems within an individual who is said to have a mental illness, perhaps within their brain chemistry, but it's also absent from a lot of psychological and psychotherapeutic understandings. And yet, all the major causes of what we in the framework probably wouldn't call mental health problems, various forms of distress and difficulty and struggles, are known to be related to inequalities of power. All the main causal factors like poverty, low social status, large differences in wealth and income, child abuse and neglect, gender-based and race-based discrimination and violence, these all indicate power inequalities and power abuses, and these are the root causes of just about every form of distress that ends up in our clinics. So that's why we started with power. First and foremost, everything in the framework flows from that, and you won't have time to and don't need to read all that teeny tiny writing, but in essence we've looked at a number of different forms of power so that we don't just focus on the very important form of power which we've called interpersonal abuse, the sort of things we've already heard about today, violence and aggression and trauma of all sorts, but we need to think about power in a very wide from a very wide perspective. We need to think about economic power. We need to think about the power that we may or may not have in our bodies, our strengths, our skills, or our difficulties, or our disabilities. We need to think about the social or cultural capital that we may or may not benefit from, and that tends to be passed on from generation to generation. And most importantly, we need to think about ideological power. Ideological power plays a very central role in the framework. And we've defined this as control of language, meaning, and perspective. So it's perhaps the least visible, but at the same time perhaps the most important form of power because it's part of every other form of power. For example, it's everywhere. It's our worldviews, it's our unstated assumptions, it's what we pick up often kind of subliminally through our education, through social media, through all sorts of other sources. It feeds into what we assume about, for example, what is a good mother, a successful child, a happy family, what images, what stereotypes do we have about refugees or about women or about men or about the so-called mentally ill and so on. And ideological power very often operates in the interests of those who are already more powerful to the disadvantage of people who are less powerful. And it often operates by the use of language, unchallenged statements like, you know, people who are out of work and can't find a job, welfare scroungers. There's a whole set of implications and assumptions in there that lead us to position people in particular ways and in fact blame them for their fates. And in mental health, educational and criminal justice systems, it's often used to turn social problems into individual ones, diagnose people as mad or bad or as failing in some way. And Nazir gave some really excellent, powerful examples of the operation of ideological power that lead in the, you know, at the end of the chain of events to things like honour killings and misogyny and abuse, and how that is also the starting point that leads to the end point of domestic abuse. We think our emphasis on ideological power adds an important extra factor to trauma-informed perspectives in that, I'm looking at the right slide, aren't I? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, good. Okay. In that it helps to explain why even people who come from relatively kind of comfortable and privileged backgrounds, I'm thinking many of our young people who have a good education, who haven't had obvious traumas in their life, can often be extremely distressed and unhappy. Now, it's not surprising when you think of the ideological power that's been directed them through all sorts of means, target-driven educational policies and bombardment of messages on social media and so on. You don't have to be to experience what we might understand as a classic trauma in order to be very, very unhappy and confused. So the next question is about what kind of threats does this pose, and very briefly, power can pose a threat in all sorts of areas of our life, to our emotions, to our social community ties, to our economic and material security, to our environments, to our bodies, perhaps just as importantly as all those, to our value base and our meaning making. Again, we're not so used to thinking about this. The power to define ourselves, to see ourselves in ways that make sense to us, to understand our distress and our experiences in ways that make sense to us, to be listened, to be validated, all the things that Nazir talked about, rather than be, let's say, characterised as someone from a broken home who doesn't count, or whatever other identity might be thrown around or imposed on people. The next question, what sense did you make of it? And of course, any of us in the room who are involved in therapy will know that therapy is, in all its guises, essentially about meaning making, but in the framework we wanted to take the understanding of meaning making back several further stages, if you like. So we don't just want to think about personal meanings or negative cognitions in CBT terms and all that kind of stuff. Meaning is an absolutely central part of the framework. All the questions hang on what the meaning is, ultimately to the person or the family or the group that's in front of you. But our meanings don't just come from nowhere. They are both made and found, to quote from the framework. So our meanings, again, come from all the messages we get around us, from the societies we live in, from the common understandings we've talked about, from the ideological messages and assumptions that very often drive those kind of discourses that are around in society. And from the framework point of view, biomedical theories about so-called mental illness can be seen as one example of the process of imposing ideologically driven theories and meanings. Biomedical understandings of distress are not evidence-based. Wish I had time to tell you more about this, but you may well be aware of the critiques. They never have been. They are presented as fact to people. They have lifelong impacts on people's identity, relationships, and they can typically set the scene for further abuses of power in which the individual's voice is invalidated and silenced, and they embark on the role and the identity of a long-term psychiatric patient, while pharmaceutical companies make a great deal of money out of them. Now, I don't want to say that nothing good happens in mental health services. I worked in mental health services for several decades myself. Good work goes on. None of this is the problem, the fault of the people who go into these jobs for very good reasons and do the very best they can. This is a systemic problem, and it's a problem based ultimately, from the framework point of view, on a faulty conceptualization of how we understand distress. So, what did you have to do to survive? This bit of the framework draws quite heavily on trauma-informed practice, so I won't go into it. It's about our threat responses in trauma-informed language, our survival responses. One of the core purposes of the framework is to reframe things that are commonly seen as symptoms in psychiatric terms as threat responses, as understandable response to threat. So restoring the link between threat and threat response is a main purpose of the framework. Psychiatric practice and much psychological practice too, own up to this as a psychologist, and psychotherapeutic practice has the effect, and some people would say at some level the purpose, of disconnecting the threat response from the threat. So it looks bizarre, it looks abnormal, or it looks like you might not be mentally well and so on. So another way of saying the same thing is we need to restore the links between personal distress, social community distress, and social injustice and inequality in all its guises, which is kind of common sense. At one level, we know that people living in poverty are much more likely to be what we might call clinically depressed. It's hardly a surprise, is it? And as soon as we know that, it's like the whole other discourse gets set up and we start talking about a new exciting generation of antidepressants, and we lose the link again. We lose the link between people's circumstances and their perfectly understandable responses. I'm going to show you a 2-second example of this. We haven't come through COVID, have we? We're living with COVID, let's put it like that. And you will doubtless have seen a lot of headlines in the national press about the extremely unfortunate coincidence of a epidemic of a deadly virus being followed hot on its heels by an epidemic of mental health problems. How unfortunate is that? 2 pandemics, one straight after the other. And to me, this way of understanding it makes very little sense. From a framework point of view, we would want to look at the people who have been hit hardest by the pandemic. If you look at the research literature, it's absolutely clear, as that slide says, the people who are most at risk are children and adolescents who've been locked up away from their friends, who've missed lots of school, older people who, of course, are more vulnerable, people at risk of domestic abuse, obviously, people from lower socioeconomic groups, of course, whose financial security has been horribly threatened, women who may be juggling childcare and work from home. The people who are already struggling are going to be struggling even more because of COVID. Now, you can wrap that up and call it a pandemic of mental health problems, if you like, but actually what COVID did was throw a massive spotlight on the terrifying level of inequalities in our society and gave us an opportunity to address it at root cause. Now, I don't think we're actually going to take that opportunity, but the opportunity is there. But I can see a sort of opportunism going on instead, whereby a number of interested parties are leaping in to say we need thousands more mental health workers and 1,000 more clinics and lots more drugs to give to people. And that is so far from being the solution we need. So I wrote this article. In ordinary language, people with more to be exhausted, depressed and anxious about are feeling more exhausted, depressed and anxious. How the general picture is of a population who's largely resilient. It is not a pandemic of mental health problems we need to fear, but a pandemic of mental health thinking. Okay, I'm going to skip a slide. I can see Debbie's got her eye on me. So I want to just mention extremely briefly that the framework does try to look beyond typically the causal factors that everyone in this room is very aware of, abuse, trauma, poverty, and so on, to look at both causal factors and healing factors from a much wider perspective. So we need to go right back to, for example, histories of colonization, slavery, intergenerational trauma, the loss of identity, culture, heritage, and land, which is typical of so many indigenous people around the world. And we need to regain some of the wisdoms that we've lost, which are about inseparability of mind, body, natural world, spirit, and so on. Many of the forms of witnessing, expressing, and healing distress around the world, which haven't yet been colonized by our diagnostic model, which is a very regrettable worldwide tendency in my view, many of those are narrative-based. They are based on narratives, often community narratives, often community ceremonies and rituals and so on. I've been pleased to share the framework with some of those indigenous groups and to have a really fascinating kind of compare and contrast. It's not about exporting the framework in the same way that we are exporting the diagnostic model. It is about saying, within our particular cultural settings, we have understandings that make sense to us, and we can each learn from the other. So, returning to the theme of narrative, storytelling and meaning-making are universal human skills. The framework provides evidence for the central role of narratives and alternative diagnosis. Narratives of all kinds. They don't have to be written narratives. Art therapy, music therapy, theatre and so on. We're going to see an example of that at the end of the day, aren't we? Really, really important means of expressing and healing distress. We all need to be skilled in narrative competence, the capacity for human beings to deeply absorb, interpret, and appropriately respond to the stories of others. Recovery is a process of reclaiming our experience in order to take back authorship of our own stories. Thank you. See you at the workshop.
Is this mic? Yes, obviously is. Firstly, just to say, Lucy, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. Thank you. I've just got a couple of questions for you before we take questions from the participants. So I'll need my glasses. I just wanted to ask you, first of all, Lucy, can you just say a little bit more about how you think the Power, Threat, Meaning framework adds to trauma-informed thinking?
Yes, that's partly why I'm here today, to hear about all this wonderful trauma-informed work, and I'm a huge fan of trauma-informed work. There's some amazing work going on, and I think there's always a danger that any radical challenge to the status quo gets kind of defaulted or assimilated back into the status quo. And part of the aim of the framework is to show how that might happen, and let's try and prevent that. So the framework is actually opposed to framings like PTSD. We don't like the D. If it's an adaptive response, how come it's a disorder? Dissociative disorder, complex trauma disorder. I mean, strategically and pragmatically, those may be better labels than things like schizophrenia, but actually they're not where we need to be. And they serve the same purpose of individualising problems, and the framework is very keen to provide a perspective, which means that it's very, very hard to lose sight of the wider social context and political context and economic context within which traumas and abuses happen.
Thanks, Lucy. And I've just got one other question for you before we open it up. Just wanted to ask, how widely has the Power, Threat, Meaning framework been implemented? Have areas taken it up and used it?
That's a good question. Obviously, it's a very, very minority approach at the moment. It only came out in 2018, but we're hopeful. And it's nothing that's happened in relation to the framework has been through us pushing it, because our plan, insofar as we had a plan, was not to push it and to see if this has any value. Will anyone be interested in taking it up and putting it into practice in their own areas? And we very much wanted that to be a collaborative process, which is what we've been involved with you and your colleagues, Debbie, because we don't have the answers for how the framework might help to inform this type of work or that type of work. But nevertheless, I'll give you two examples. One is a very large trust, the largest trust in London, I think, Central and North West London Trust, has taken on the framework in a pilot study in combination with trauma-informed approaches on its 2 acute inpatient wards, has been so successful it's been rolled out across all their 14 acute inpatient wards, is now being rolled out across their community teams, their liaison teams, and possibly other teams, including their perinatal service, because it achieves such dramatically welcome results in terms of reduction in seclusion and restraints on the ward, and massive increase in staff morale in a service that was very low on morale, and so on. So that's really going into the belly of the beast, if you like, at the front line of the most medicalised services, which is very gratifying to hear. And right the other end of the spectrum, we've been particularly pleased to find that a number of peer groups have taken it up outside services. It's not just meant for professionals and not just meant for service settings, have come across the framework, have decided we're going to sit down together, work through these questions collectively as a group, see if we can, that helps us to make sense of our distress in a different way. A couple of the groups have written articles, which is fab. They're on the PTMF website. And one or two of those people have now joined the framework committee in order to collaborate in giving training in the framework. So that also a really, really rewarding thing to hear people being able to, if they want to, liberate themselves from a diagnostic narrative which is no longer serving them.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Lucy. And I'm going to open it up now for questions.
That's a really good question, which comes up a lot. And I have to say, out of all the labels that I dislike and disagree with, BPD is the worst. And, you know, what a classic example of individualising the nearly always the end result of experiencing horribly traumatic events, and both, you know, giving the person an identity of mad and bad at the same time. Horrible. And, you know, I'm equally concerned about the apparent massive rise in children with what is said to be ADHD, which is not that these terms may well identify real problems like restlessness and lack of attention and inability to learn and so on. But the construct of ADHD, etc., is not a scientifically valid one. It doesn't denote some neurological disorder which we can actually legitimately diagnose in the way that we can, you know, other problems. So, but we are in a difficult situation where people need labels for benefits sometimes. So the framework itself is a very idealistic document, and I always say, particularly as a former clinician, we had to be pragmatic in practice. If somebody needs a label for a certain service, I would be very happy, and I have been in the past happy to put it in the right place, on the right form, but I would very much want to have the conversation with the person first. I wouldn't want to be saying, you need a high level of benefits because you have schizophrenia or psychosis. I'd want to be saying, we are understanding your problems in this way, and the system as it is works like this. Now, there's a number of labels I could put in here. They're more or less interchangeable, and which one is most acceptable to you? And I know a number of other clinicians who work in that way as well. I'm not familiar with that questionnaire. Okay, sorry. So the question for people online was that you use a questionnaire called the Impact of Events questionnaire. Is that right, in your work with, did you say young people? Or, yeah, and do you find that helpful? And what's my view about questionnaires and whether or not they're helpful? And do I use any questionnaires? Okay, so I'm a bit allergic to questionnaires myself, but I'm not familiar with the ones that you mentioned. But I think I would say that any questionnaire that opens up a narrative and enriches a narrative is likely to be helpful, and certainly the framework isn't prescriptive about that, and nor would I want to be. And too many questions, in my view, actually close down the narrative. And I didn't like, but I very much recognised Nazir's story about yet another risk assessment. How is that going to help us? It's not. So I think we have to use our judgment about that, don't they? If it works for you, then that's great. And if the framework questions work for you, that's great. If they don't, find something that does work. Oh. Okay. Thank you. Somebody's interested in the backlash. Can we just overrun by an hour or two, Debbie? So We've got 10 minutes. That's amazing. I could have shown you far more slides. Okay. Well, there's been a major backlash. I was going to say go on Twitter, but don't go on Twitter. It's a very bad idea. But anyway, I have a hashtag @ClinPsychLucy. If you look at @ClinPsychLucy and scroll through and particularly type in certain keywords like bully, abuser, ideologue and things, you'll come up with a lot of stuff. So it's a bit hard to tell how widespread the backlash is because it's been very, very unpleasant on social media. But actually, I've never met an audience that was anything other than friendly, and that didn't mean everyone was agreeing. I'm not here to sell anything, and it is not my aim to make people agree with me. I think I once had a junior doctor walk out, but I don't know what they say about behind my backs, but anyway, they're always friendly to my face. And I've talked to a lot of audiences, including audience people who you might not think were natural kind of fans of the framework, potential fans of the framework. But the backlash has been, it's not for a particular profession, because many psychiatrists are very supportive of us and very aware of the problems that their profession and their theoretical stance are facing. It's not all some psychologists hate the framework, and it's been quite controversial within the BPS. I could say more about that, but I won't. I think they're a bit surprised at what they've unleashed on the world, and the BPS is not an organisation that actually likes controversy. I think what I found most difficult is a very divisive conversations that have happened on social media between survivors, and people become very strongly identified with their labels, of course, and that is absolutely not a problem for me. We really, really are not saying we're going to go around the country stripping people of their labels and saying they can't describe themselves in this way. But the underlying tone of some of the backlash is not just, I don't want to see my problems in this way, I don't want to work in this way, which is fine, but nobody should ever have thought, written or published this stuff, which is not so fine. But then if you look at it from a power lens, we are presenting a big threat to power at all levels. So I would be disappointed not to have a backlash, but I can't say I enjoy it. But the way to frame it is we're having an impact. Anything's better than being ignored. We're having an impact. There's some very silly thread I saw on Twitter this morning about someone saying, what should we call the movement that's been started by Johnston, Reed, Kinderman, Bentall, and a few other people? Anyway, two things struck me about that. One, that they'd included any survivor names. This is a co-produced document. If there's a movement, the survivors are contributing just as much and in many ways more than the professionals, but that's how it's being framed. Two, there's going to be a hell lot of abuse coming out of this. Three, we've made an impact. We're a movement. We're a movement. It's an unnamed movement so far. This is the Twitter quiz that's going on. It's an unnamed movement, but it's a movement. I call it common sense. So I didn't hear the last bit. Sorry, I still didn't hear that last bit. Okay, not sure. I think I understand what they're getting at. I would try to avoid the word implementing it. We as framework authors are not about implementing anything. We're about putting a set of ideas out there and seeing if anyone's interested. Anyone else wants to implement it in any way in their setting, that's fine. And I do quite a lot of training on it, and I would always say, of course, you can't go further and faster than people are ready or willing to go. And that varies from setting to setting. So, for example, there's a charity in Ireland, Jigsaw, that does a lot of work with young people across Ireland, which has adopted the framework in a pretty wholesale way, but that was relatively easy because they're independent, they're not really answerable to anyone, they decided that's what they wanted to do and that's what they've done. So it's in their policies, it's in their language, it's in their assessment procedures and so on. Whereas in the trust in central northwest London, really had to be quite a slow process. It's nearly 5 years so far of offering, getting feedback, trying it out, and getting people on board in a much more gradual way. I think that's the best I can say. You have to kind of start where people are and go as far as people are willing or able to move. And if people aren't interested, our policy is very much to push at open doors, not as all the authors have spent most of their lives doing, bang their heads against closed ones. So it's nice to be here. I think this is a place for open doors, which is why it's particularly nice to be here today. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the question is, many of the young people you work with who've had very traumatic backgrounds actually want and find a diagnostic label helpful to help them, from their perspective, validate and make meaning of their distress. And that's obviously a dilemma I faced throughout my clinical career. And obviously I wouldn't be saying to people, you realise that label is just made up and has no scientific validity whatsoever. In fact, the chair of the DSM-4 committee has just described almost the entire content of DSM as bullshit. I wouldn't say that, although I'd think it. So, I mean, it's like any other question. We have to work alongside people, don't they? And if that's your preferred narrative, and it's a narrative of sorts, isn't it? I can't help it. I don't have to feel so guilty. I can find my tribe. I can feel that it wasn't my fault. I think it's a great pity we have such simplistic narratives available generally. Mary Boyler's called this the brain or blame dilemma. Either it's my brain, it's my chemical imbalance, it's my ADHD, I can't help it, or I must be to blame, I must be inadequate, or else someone else must be to blame, and I have to feel very bad about myself. We need something in between, and I think the in-between has to be different narratives, which are about, I have done the best I possibly could in my difficult circumstances, and with support I can find some ways forward. So I would work alongside that young person, and I'd want to open it up for discussion at the very least and introduce them to some critiques, and they can take it or they can leave it or they can come back to it. But feeling validated and feeling a sense of meaning is very important. We've all gone through that as kind of young people many years ago, in my case. But I guess my additional question is, should we we as professionals, be offering these labels in the first place? I absolutely think we shouldn't. And, people wouldn't be playing with these labels if nobody had told them that there was such a thing as bipolar disorder in the first place, which obviously there isn't. And this appears to be a very controversial point, that professionals should not, in effect, tell lies to people. But controversially, I believe they shouldn't. We don't tell people they're possessed by demons or they've got wandering wombs or any of the stuff we've now discarded, or that too much yellow bile or black bile or whatever. I mean, the whole model of psychiatry is understood should have been chucked out for exactly the same reasons decades ago, and we should no longer be offering these kind of pseudoscientific explanations in the first place. Okay, so the question is, do you need a lot of extra staff and resources to put this in practice in the first place, and how have they done it in central northwest London? Well, interestingly, and you contrast it with open dialogue, which means the whole team has to go away and spend days and days and days training themselves in a very special way so they don't interrupt people when they're talking to them and so on, and tell them they've got something wrong with them. Okay, so interestingly, CNWL has done this with existing resources, no extra resources, although I would say the core team that's been driving this project has put in hours and hours and hours and hours unpaid, but that's kind of what happens, isn't it? But I would also say if you went into any of these wards, you wouldn't see something miraculous. You wouldn't see a kind of soothing trauma-informed environments full of cushions and gentle music. You'd see a standard psychiatric ward. But along with that, some very different and very productive things are happening. So in principle, I don't think it needs to take a massive amount of extra resources and training. They do offer standard half-day training for all new staff, and they offer regular one-day training for all staff. That's all done in-house. So there's the cost of taking people off the ward to do that. But, I mean, that's probably minimal compared to the other millions of other types of trainings that staff have to do. So, again, it's, you know, I'm sure if anyone handed them a large budget, they'd be very happy to do something more ambitious. But introducing new ideas into the system, which is what we so desperately, desperately need, doesn't have to be expensive or resource heavy. And unless or until you introduce new ideas, anything else you introduce is likely to end up with essentially the same ineffective system.
Thanks, Lucy. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.